I am Michael Pearl. I run global sales here at ZEDEDA, and I'm excited today to welcome Fred Loucks to the session to talk more about IT modernization at the edge. So with that, Fred, I want to turn it over to you for a quick introduction and really more about you, more about the company, kind of solutions that you have, your customers, and then we'll go into some great topics.
Yeah, fantastic. So like Michael said, my name's Fred Loucks, and I've spent the last decade of my professional career in audiovisual, specifically. My formal education's in theater, actually, focusing specifically in theater technology, sound design, show control, automation, things like that. I've worked in professional theater, higher education, commercial AV, and most recently spent time in 2 Fortune 100 enterprises, one in software and one in semiconductor. In one case, joining a pretty mature team and helping them advance their more forward-thinking initiatives, and in the other case, working with senior leadership there to actually build the architecture and strategies from the ground level. Since then, I've joined Level3 Audiovisual. We're a AV managed service provider and systems integrator. My role there is to envision, prioritize, and execute the technology strategy for Level3, both internal technologies and external technologies we develop for our customers and offers products. So Level3 is an audiovisual systems integrator, and we've been offering those services for 25 years. We're a distributed company, but our home base is in the Phoenix metro area. And our core business has traditionally been in the design, build, AV systems integration services space. Like most technology companies, though, we're in a state of transition from the traditional product transactional business models to more outcomes or subscription-based business models. To that end, we've been developing a set of really forward-thinking managed services, especially for our industry. And those have initially been focused on enterprise architectures and global systems deployment, but of course also have ambitions to branch out from there and continue to uncover ways to make our customers' lives easier and better enable their core businesses and such. Speaking of customers, our customers are from a lot of different industries and verticals. We're really active in the corporate vertical, so think conference rooms, training rooms, boardrooms, things like that. We also do a lot of work in higher education for test rooms, healthcare, in meeting rooms and simulation, and even some municipal and government facilities. So far, those managed service offerings are really targeted at the enterprise, but we're working hard to take the efficiencies and lessons that we've learned from doing those services at scale and then bring that value to our SMB customers as well, really focused on connecting with the right kinds of customers, those kind of customers that want to talk about partnership and outcomes-driven services versus just selling product and things like that. So that's a bit about myself and the organization.
That's awesome. And ironically, I learned something new about you from the theater piece. My daughter, both my kids are into theater, and the oldest, she started out as a theater tech major. That's what her interest is. She loved doing sound and lights in high school, and then was starting to go down that path for a while in college, but has kind of switched. But they both love theater, so that's great that you have that background. That's really unique, and I'm going to ping you on that to learn more after this. But it's funny because I remember back in the days when I first started doing like really extensive demos with all these screens and with the Crestron, like gadget that you could control, and it's a panel on a wall and you're selecting, and it was so kludgy and you never knew what would work or not work. But now I have in my home, on my home theater, I just bought a Samsung tablet, right? And bought some app, and it has infrared and it can control things. But kind of leading into our discussion here around IT and what does that mean? But we've gone from this very different way of doing AV to now a very app-driven, I think, a different kind of world, and especially what you're part of. But tell me about how does this fit into IT now? How has that changed? What's the game there?
Yeah. So it's interesting. You hit on a lot of the major points there. And the biggest one for me is all around video conferencing. Video conferencing really created the momentum for AV becoming a huge part of IT's responsibility in the IT stack. So, video conferencing is 100% dependent on IT for execution and troubleshooting. The AV industry's played a role in the past, standing up some on-premise servers, usually more like appliances made by the VC providers, and creating these private video conferencing WANs. But This is all always resided on the network. And today, those video conferencing systems are all largely cloud-based, right? They're application-based and they're cloud-based. And the AV industry is really just providing endpoints that run those apps, and enabling endpoints to connect to these video conferencing or UCC platforms. Now, it's interesting because along with this transition from, the in-room only conference room, right? The I'm going to plug in my laptop that I brought, or use an overhead projector or whatever it might be to, share some content and do some kind of work in the room. Video conferencing exploded the ability for every conference room to connect to other conference rooms, primarily, not really other people quite yet. That'll come in, as time goes on. But conference room to conference room exploded, and then as the applications really started taking off and we got to these less expensive video conferencing platforms, these more cloud-based video conferencing platforms, then it becomes users at home or at their desk or wherever they might be being able to join in too. And so this creates this huge, massive upswing in video conferencing adoption, right? Businesses start relying more and more on VC, not just for executives like it used to be, but really at every level of the organization. You'll lean on video conferencing to cut travel costs, improve communication between team members and suppliers and customers, and especially I found in my global experience, overcoming language barriers with colleagues on other areas of the world. Video conferencing is helpful for expressing and communicating across languages in particular. So, all of this led up to video's here to stay, right? And this increased demand, when you need conference rooms all over the place, you can't spend as much as we used to on conference rooms, right? So you can't spend 50 grand on every conference room in your organization or more, right? You need a lower cost option. And that's when you start getting these PC or USB based systems, or these all-in-one Android appliances that are just running apps. The biggest thing, the big trend now are these single endpoints, right? That include mics, speakers, camera, video outputs, compute requirements, all of that in one. It's no analog connections, nothing's proprietary. It's just a network jack and an HDMI connection, and everything's all built in. It's very simple. And you can deploy these things at scale affordably and create a good experience for your customers or your colleagues in this case, and I manage it. So this was before the pandemic. All this stuff before that. So COVID-19 sent, most of our knowledge workers home and the conference rooms vacated, but that really only expanded the dependence on video conferencing. Again, coming back to video conferencing, and AV at the desk, the webcams, the speakerphones, right? Those kinds of things. It just continued to expand our dependence on those technologies. So, it's been, a year plus of that kind of super VC dependence since the pandemic began. And those IT teams are now looking back at their offices, just like business leaders are, and going, what are we going to do? How do we replicate this experience, back to our conference room? So I digress and say video conferencing has been the single biggest driver, and it continues to be the biggest driver of why AV, especially in the corporate position, makes sense under IT teams. So that'd be I think my main take there. Now, if I kind of follow on to that, just one quick comment, and that is, I think it's important to note that AV and IT are two very different things, but they're complementary. So AV is that thin layer between digital and human, right? It's screens, speakers, microphones, cameras, lighting. It's that experience that overlays and enhances raw material. So whether that's just a simple file playback like most theaters might be, right? Or a live production with 100 performers, AV brings that experience to life for people. It just so happens that it's pretty simple now, especially in the conference room space. And so it makes a lot of sense to try and do that at scale within IT organizations.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I came from Cisco, right? So from a collaboration solution, WebEx, all the panels, the touch screens. You get video conferencing to the next level in some ways, but it's not really always very integrated. It's pretty Cisco specific. Now, now you look at the IT perspective, and I'm just thinking modernization, what to mean to that. It's probably a lot of security and authentication. A camera can go, hey, what people hack into cameras. So from your perspective, modernization to them, especially around an AV type solution, what does that mean from an IT perspective? What do they care about in modernization around those types of solutions in conference rooms, or potentially endpoints that are outside, virtual, like you mentioned?
Yeah, yeah. It's a huge concern. I think it's completely overlooked in a lot of the AV industry, which I think is unfortunate. The IT teams aren't overlooking it; they see it, but like I said, AV has been this little sub pocket within the IT organization, and as it gets more and more required and more mainstream, these kinds of things are coming to light. So the number one thing when I think about modernizing AV, I think of security. I think of management at scale, and I think of like consistency and experience, right, for the colleagues. So on the management side, like AV appliances are super messy. I'm pretty disparaging of my own industry when it comes to administration of endpoints across global scale because I had to do it, and it's not easy. There's no Ansible playbooks for AV, right? There's no very few REST APIs across AV devices. It's a lot of it's telnet sessions and SSH sessions, and
Wow.
sometimes hex over socket, and a lot of times, HTTP, unencrypted web interfaces for control. It's all GUI driven. And in kind of the worst case, it's some sort of proprietary software they have to run on a Windows client in the LAN to actually manage the device or with a direct IP. Only recently we started to see the manufacturers generating some cloud IoT solutions where they can do administration at scale and such. But even that's problematic. IoT is can be a bit scary, and the especially when you consider the all of the recent array of hacks within the IT supply chain. Um, Having a device that is connected out to some third-party service, whether you want it to be or not, is a risk. And so with AV, you take the same best practices that you'd apply to any IoT appliance, and that is the best practice is segmentation, right? If you want to secure it, we start to transition from management to security here. If you want to secure it, you have to segment it. That's kind of number one thing you can do.
Mm.
And so a lot of times that comes down all the way to the LAN, right? AV devices can be deployed in their own private networks. This is a double-edged sword, though, for management, right? So if you're on your corporate network, but you're creating, small LANs that are segmented either through a gateway or even air gapped, potentially, you've just lost all of your management capabilities, which is not great at scale, right? You might be able to get away with it if you have one office and 5 conference rooms. That's fine. You can walk between the rooms and you're okay. But when you're trying to, take a team of 5 or 6 engineers and administer 2,500 conference rooms globally, can't do it unless you're connected. So that's where edge comes in for me. Edge is
Yeah,
really
that was
like
my next question. You really
yeah,
jumped into it, so that's good because I really wanted to see and talk about from a modernization. Now you have edge, right? And I keyed in on one thing that we did over time was we really kind of just started to see where the business was shifting a bit from IoT and industrial to truly a distributed edge. Edge is not necessarily, in a back room. Edge is not necessarily in a very dirty, hot environment, right? For us, right? Edge could be in a lot of places, and now you're talking about edge in the conference room. So, how does edge really fit in? And you also mentioned the kind of segmentation, because I think from a security standpoint and segmentation and the networks and everything else, how does that equation fit into your deployments and your customer requests and requirements today?
yeah. So first, a bit of level setting as far as the edge goes. I think, I typically would hear this referred to as like the intelligent edge, right? Or there's all sorts of nomenclatures for it, and it's kind of tricky to track. But, you know, where you typically see a gateway at the edge of like an OT or factory network, that's pretty similar to how it would work in AV, right? We have these same networks that are specific to that, to this solution. That's the AV network or the AV VLAN or whatever it might be. And they're often, like I said, segmented locally, and they're isolated from the customer network, hopefully either through some kind of a gateway, like a network gateway, or potentially even air gapped. And for larger organizations, they tend to live on the corporate network broadly, but they'll be in an AV LAN that's routable, right? So you at least have global access to those systems. The worst case scenarios, mind you, are when those systems live on the client network, right, or the user network within the system. Just complete. Once you're inside the trust boundary, you have complete unmitigated access to other systems. So obviously very scary, and we've seen the impact of that. So AV systems, when we're talking edge and edge compute in particular, we're talking inside those AV networks, whatever they might be. They could be global VLANs or global WAN networks specific to AV. That's fine. That's the edge for us. But it could also be in a room that's air gapped from the rest of the customer network. We could be using cellular connectivity in and out of that system, or we could be, getting like a DMZ port or something like that, or very restricted access out through a gateway. So we have to be flexible in the way we define the edge for our customers, because it varies based on their use cases, needs, and largely on their network topologies. What are we doing there? There's actually a really old use case in the edge for AV, and that is remote support. That's kind of like table stakes for AV integrators. Is we need to be able to get to the systems we deploy because they're complex, and most of our customers don't have on-site staff to the level that they need to support those systems when something goes wrong. Not to mention, we sell systems with warranties, so we need to be able to get in and get to them remotely. It's a lot cheaper than trying to roll a truck every time, especially you start dealing with larger organizations. The scary part of this, right, the dirty little secret of this, is that this has most typically been done by deploying an unmanaged Windows PC out into the customer's environment. You buy an Intel NUC off the shelf, right? You put it in the customer's environment. What do you put on it? Yes, TeamViewer, log me in, whatever it is, right?
There you go.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's been the most common method to do that, provide that kind of service. And, for anyone who's listening, like, this should be sending off alarm bells, right? Like, bad news, don't do this stuff. This is really bad. And it skyrockets your risk for both customer and provider. So that's where we had to start thinking of things a little differently in the edge and in edge security than we would have typically thought.
One thing you didn't mention, so I'm going to ask you about it, is the updates, the software upgrades. And, I think from edge deployment, and especially probably in your world, you're working with a lot of different applications. And I've heard some companies, large companies that have contracted with companies in certain spaces that they send an upgrade every 6 weeks, and sometimes they're critical, right? That alone can be a challenge. And you probably are dealing with a lot of different unique applications, sometimes probably customized applications, I'm assuming, right? But from working with IT and kind of, modernization and edge, how does that paradigm fit together for you?
Yeah. This is another one of those, like, operating standards within the AV industry has been, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the definition of broke has varied widely, but most AV solutions, you typically get implemented. We're talking like a 5-year life cycle. A lot of AV systems go in once, and they are not patched, managed, or upgraded, especially in small and medium business. Aren't patched, managed, or upgraded whatsoever over the course of their life, which, from an asset perspective is like 5 years, but in practice, it can be 7 to 10 years of this system sitting on your network, in your customer, in your environment, doing who knows what, and not being typically managed. So there's a huge risk here. And it's fundamentally changed since this video conferencing application-based mindset and paradigm has been introduced. We didn't worry about it as much typically because a lot of, in the past, these systems weren't connected to the network in any meaningful way. They had no IoT stacks. They were LAN only, and they were often segmented. It's a little different now, right? Zoom releases updates constantly, and that they should. They're a software company. That's what they do, right? And we have to accommodate for those updates. We have to make sure our systems are maintained, not just from a security perspective, though that is, obviously very important, but from a user experience perspective, right? And that's kind of what I mean by security, management, user experience. These are the 3 big things, and patching is fundamentally 3 of them. So how do you do that? There's a lot of different ways of dealing with it now, but you either have an auto update mechanism, which always comes with some level of risk, but it depends on where you're gonna place the risk, right? Do you place the risk with the software developers to release software that's stable, or and take the risk of 0-day vulnerabilities, or do you put the risk on your integrator or your partner to, or your internal staff to update those systems on a lagged basis or something like that. Not to mention most of these systems, they just don't have the controls to specify and tag to a specific version, right? You're going to say update, and it's going to go out and find the most recent update in a lot of cases. So firmware and patching controls, very complicated in the AV space, but the trend is towards update faster, let the software developer control the pace of the updates, because they're the ones who know their product the best and don't get in the way of executing on that. And for devices that do not have an OTA update mechanism, you need a change management cycle and a process in place. And this is one of the things that, it's where companies like me come in. We bring in and build managed services around this kind of stuff to help deliver on that, on that specific issue.
All right, and I'm going to pause for a second and just see if there's any questions from the audience. Please type them in as we continue on. I think I wanted to play off of one area that I think is important and kind of stay on the topic of modernization, but around the updates in the architecture. And I'm pretty sure that from a modernization standpoint, some of the things you're doing, you're looking at a mixed architecture, but I think you're also looking at K3S, lightweight containers, a way to really build this out and scale this out over time versus just, virtual machines. How do you see that playing into what IT cares about as well? Like when they look at that and they look at your architecture, are there a lot of questions about the types of apps, how they're run, how they're built, or really it's just, okay, this is great. Give me the apps and, the functionality we need to run our conference rooms. Like what do they care about? And how is what you're building important to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, our to kind of answer the initial question, we have a mix of off the shelf and customized and slightly tailored or completely home built applications that we employ. And the type of, I mentioned earlier, the type of customer we're looking for is very outcomes focused. So our first effort, our first push is trying to create outcome driven SLAs around what are you trying to accomplish, and let's bring the right applications to bear, even if they don't exist yet. Right? We'll work to develop them or modify them to fit the business case. And as we start getting into the architectural review, the nice thing is we have really good partners. So some of our applications are off the shelf or slightly tailored, slightly customized, or largely containerized. And we have really great partners who know how to talk about their products and know how to empower us as their partner on how to talk about the product and what it is and why it works and how it's secure and the value that it can offer. So there's definitely interest on, we are essentially running a type 1 hypervisor at the edge, and what are you running on it, right? The other part of it is my AV colleagues, which most of the time care less about that and care more about the outcomes and services, right? There's just, I think, a little less scrutiny. It tends to be within those particular working groups, and I think some of that just comes with a lack of experience in virtualization. But there's certainly a level of scrutiny, and there are questions, and we're always happy to answer them and dig into those specific things. But it all comes down to we are essentially delivering a managed SaaS or managed as a service solution. So it all comes down to we're deploying an appliance, and that's part of the value of what we do is we are deploying an appliance, and it's ours, and we own the responsibility for everything that talks in and out of that appliance. And we give a very good outward view of what that appliance needs to talk to and how it needs to communicate and what kind of things we're going to do with it. But it's very different from if I had an application and I was trying to go into the customer's data center on the customer's hypervisor architectures, whatever they might be using, and deploy that app into their solutions and have them manage it or maintain it. So it's been very interesting. And on that note, it's actually kind of part of the story as to how I found ZEDEDA and why that ended up mattering to me, that flexibility between those two. If you don't mind, I really would just dive in right to that.
No, I think, crazy enough, of course, you and I seem to be on the same wavelength because, again, I was going to jump into that and really talk about, how you found this. And from what I recall, as you went through your cycle and you had some competitors you were looking at, or people that could have been competitors. I mean, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of solutions in the industry really that do this. I mean, people can build their own. They can look at creating some kind of solution through maybe some pieces of what we do, right? There's just not a lot, and it's hard to compare apples to apples. It just is, right? And I know you went through that. So I think it's also interesting to kind of go through the story of how you found us, what else you were looking at. You don't have to name names, but just in general, like, and why did you choose ZEDEDA, and how, what were the reasons? Like, what really it was about that, how you were going to use this to go forward and deploy this next gen solution to help your customers?
Yeah, well, it all comes back to that log me in PC, right? That we knew we couldn't do that. That was table stakes. We knew we couldn't do that. We knew in today's era we had to have something not only more secure. Again, that's table stakes foundation stuff, right? It had to be more secure. We had to eliminate risk to our customers through that particular endpoint. But beyond that, it had to be operationally scalable. And there's nothing less operationally scalable than trying to manage individual PCs without any kind of solution to tie them together. So the biggest piece for us was we wanted to take that. We wanted all the value that we could get out of the cloud, but we wanted it at the edge, right? And I wanted containerized applications that I could deploy one image and have it deploy out to hundreds or thousands of endpoints and maintain that, and maintain specific environment variables and distinct, idiosyncrasies, across various endpoints. We wanted all those operational efficiencies so we could stay really lean as a team and focus mostly on development delivery. And it was a 6-month journey that led us to ZEDEDA. I've got a folder in my browser, boys, if you're familiar with the reference, and I have 250 links easy to different interesting solutions and services and providers and startups and established businesses all over technology, as I searched and searched and searched to try and find the right combination of services to deliver what we were looking for. And wow. I got pretty close a few times, or I thought I was pretty close, but it came down to, I'm never going to be able to touch this endpoint once it's out. So I can't ever have to touch it. I can't ever have to log in with a serial cable or something like that. That can never happen. And I don't really want it to be able to be accessible from the LAN anyway. I don't want it to be accessible from the ports anyway. I want it to be a black box, completely secure, completely locked down. I wanted it to be to have disk encryption and have hardware root of trust, which is like a huge ask, right? That immediately set the bar very, very high as far as tooling in this industry. I didn't want a 4 or 5 month or 6 month onboarding process, writing some kind of customized Linux kernel and trying to build in Yocto or go down that path. We just don't have the developer resources. We're a systems integrator and a managed service provider. We're not a developer at our core. So we had to build development competencies, but we had to find tools that were going to jumpstart us to success here. We wanted to implement agile deployment methodologies, right? I wanted to maybe even be able to build a continuous delivery pipeline for our apps. I don't want to have to go out and deal with this operationally day in and day out because it'll cripple my ability to work at scale. But I also couldn't just have containers, and that became really clear when I took a hard look at the industry as it sits. Every piece of software in the AV industry today, I would say with like a 98% certainty or very little error in there, is virtual machine, Windows desktop or Windows. Yeah. All of it. And so, much like in many other places in the industrial networks, things like that, we're dealing with Windows Server applications by and large, some appliances and some things like that, but it's almost always that. And even some other ones, we've got stuff running on like, CentOS and stuff like that, like other distributions and no ability to containerize, nor any momentum to move towards containers in the AV industry. I mean, I'll say it again, no momentum. Nobody's talking about this. Wow. So we're pretty, I think we're pretty cool, and we're thinking, ahead of the curve within our industry, but it's important to remember that, we're also behind the curve for everyone else in software and IT a lot of the time. So I'm trying to catch up and go, what are the best practices and how do we stop bulking them? How do we start implementing them and working within them? And so we found out pretty quick that yes, containers wanted to be our go forward. When we wrote apps, we would put them into containers. If we had our choice, we would deploy containers, but we needed a method to deploy virtual machine applications. And that's a big way of how we deliver our appliance. We can take industry standard AV applications and deliver them in a managed appliance as a service, right? We can essentially deliver them as managed SaaS on premise where they need to be because they're low latency or they're meant to supply, meant to operate on the trusted edge. But we can now deliver those without necessarily needing the IT organization and more into the data center and resources teams. They don't have to host those applications or administer them. They can get them as an appliance through an MSP, and it just eliminates a lot of the risk that they have and puts that all behind a managed service agreement.
Yeah, that's great. And I've got a follow up on it that's kind of tied to it, and that was great information. The follow up there, and it kind of ties both ways. And I want your thoughts, right? Open source, right? Mm-hmm. How much was open source an influencer, from our ability to provide EvoS and even with the end user, like the IT organizations? Is that important? Does that enable any future proofing at your customer site? Like, do they care about open source? I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I'll say, starting internally, I cared about open source because we're working in a really niche industry, and there are some very niche things that we have to deal with. And so I knew that there's nothing off the shelf, truly off the shelf, that's going to do everything we need it to do. We're going to need to combine services, and we're going to need to customize things. So the ability for me to go in and participate in the EvoS community, for example, helped me bring, for example, to test hardware that was really well in our hardware class, and to work on the upstream project to help, get very specific types of hardware that would work very well for our particular type of vertical. And that was incredible to be able to participate on the open source side and help to not just consume the technology, but also help contribute to it and help make ZEDEDA a better company and have a better product as well. It was just a super empowering process. And all of my solutions, two of the three of my solutions are open source at their base and have tons of open source product that they are leveraging and sponsoring. And I work within those communities on GitHub and help build out those applications. And it's made a huge difference for us because we've been able to tweak here and there and even make pull requests and push those tweaks back into the community and help make a better mousetrap. On the other hand of that, as far as our customers go, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think the supply chain hacks haven't helped anything as far as that, that line of thinking. And I have to tell the story a lot and emphasize the point a lot that open source, in my mind, is fundamentally more secure than proprietary, not less secure. Community review of software and having many eyes and many contributors on that software all the time is a strength, not a weakness. And especially when we can take that open source software and get the the nuggets of value that it allows for, and then we can wrap it as an appliance and as a service, rather than the enterprise trying to consume it directly and having to build their own support models for it and everything else like that. We get to kind of have the best of both worlds, an open source backed product or layers of open source backed products that we are able to offer support and honestly, at the end of the day, deliver an outcome around without the enterprise needing to go through the whole process of discovering, standing it up, staffing the solution, operating it, and all of those things.
Yeah, insightful, right? It's helpful. I love to hear about my customers and their thoughts around it, and how it also influences the end customer, right? Your customers, when it comes down to security, or they're asking those types of questions, and they do truly, your bigger customers, they may deep dive, they may want to go a little deeper. The contracts may have to have certain language, right? It does sometimes make a difference. So that's great, and appreciate the insight there. I think we're getting close to the end of our session, but I did want to ask you another question, just from trends, industry's trends. Where do you see the industry growing, to, and AV at the edge, what does this look like? What does it look like from scale, from features? How is this going to change the game, what you're doing in 5 years?
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. When I think of industry trends right now, it's hard to escape the impact that the hybrid work model has had and continues to have on audiovisual and the services we provide. So I think there's just a ton of movement still happening in that space, and we have customers come to us all the time with the exact scenario I set up earlier, right? We've come back or looking at our offices or looking at our real estate and going, how do we best use this space, and how do we create that, you know, that on-site is the new off-site kind of feel, right? How do we create that enticing place for our colleagues to come back to and enjoy when it makes sense for the organization and for them. And so a lot of that has been, you know, conference rooms, just as an example, from a trends perspective. Conference rooms were designed to be, you know, to meet in the room with maybe someone on the other end, or maybe another room, or maybe two. And so the traditional bowling alley design of, you know, the boardroom chairs along the end, that's a terrible video conferencing experience, right? Bar none, it's awful, right? Turn sideways, everybody's through varying sizes, you can't tell who's talking, the lighting's usually terrible. It's a really bad experience, especially when compared to this experience. Everybody has equal space and you know, it's nice and emphasized when they talk. And so we're redesigning the conference room paradigm, right? We're changing the way conference rooms look. We're developing different types of conference rooms with different layouts and different arrangements and different technologies that help facilitate a better experience for those largely remote experiences, as well as let's focus in for those on-site experiences and make those on-site experiences as good as we possibly can too, and not worry as much about the remote experience for those spaces. You know, purpose-built spaces on your campus, on your premise, for purpose-built applications, which, you know, makes perfect sense when you think about it. Alongside that's gone this, you know, this workplace analytics trend has really spiked up. We want to know how many people are there. We want to know our utilization, not just for social distancing, you know, practices and things like that, but just to value the real estate, you know, and that's really, I think, the big chunk of the next normal in the AV space is how do we best help facilitate work, you know, organizations to manage and value their real estate and their workplace and measure it, make data-driven decisions. And the edge is huge there. So, you know, most of these audiovisual devices, right, they weren't meant to be managed by machines. We talked about that earlier. They're meant to be managed by people. So how do you get data from them? You have to write software. You have to write software, you have to write drivers. You have to communicate them and script them like a human would interact with them, but you have to build your own software to do that. That's what we're doing. And we enable a really detailed parsing method and communication with these endpoints that are generally kind of dumb in their communication capabilities. And then we aggregate that all into, you know, an IoT big data solution so that we can now start building customized dashboards and reporting and, you know, operation status and things like that around all this data from different manufacturers, not just in their point cloud solutions for their IoT stacks, but in ours, in one place, whether we have to get that data from the cloud using API connections to their services, or more often than not, on the edge, using our bastion host, as it were, right, our proxy to communicate with those endpoints in a scripted manner, get the data from them, and then relay that up, all happening on the inside of the trusted boundary, where protocols like Telnet and others can be done with a relative layer of security, isolated from the rest of the client network and all of those things. We can get that data without needing to try and get it all directly to the internet. So that's been a huge part of
interesting.
that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I kind of like tried to come up with a term on that. And it almost sounds like in some ways real estate optimization, right? How are you going to use your rooms? How many people are really there? Is that the right configuration for the room? Should you even have a room? Is anybody using the room? Like, and then you get into the hybrid world that we're going to be in, where there's going to be probably a mixed environment, especially for a long time. I don't think we'll ever go back to like true 100%. You work in an office, drive to your office. You know, it's going to change, right? And so, collaboration, communication, the whole space around this, you know, what you're building, and it may end up that your own home office becomes an extended conference room, not just a Zoom session, but an extended conference room. And, you know, apps like what you're building may be part of that. It may be a lightweight edge that helps to bring you into that environment. You know, I can foresee, you know, pieces like that. But again, Fred, I want to thank you. Great session today. Really excited to have you as a customer. Great to pick your brain and kind of hear about, you know, what your industry is doing. And, you know, you're in a different space of edge for us. Like it really is like kind of on the the true distributed part of our network. And I thank you for being a great customer, and look forward to helping you get deployed all over the place, and a very successful relationship. Thank you for participating in the panel, and have a great rest of your week.
Hey, absolutely. Same here. Take care, and thanks for the time.
All righty. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining.